Sarah moved into the Henderson house on a warm September afternoon. She was 32 years old with long dark hair and green eyes that seemed to change color with her mood. She had married Richard Henderson just 3 months earlier, after a whirlwind romance that surprised everyone who knew them. Richard was 45, a successful lawyer with silver hair and an easy smile. He owned a beautiful home in the suburbs with a large garden and a swimming pool. Richard had one son from his previous marriage. Marcus was 19 years old and lived at home while attending the local community college. His mother had died from cancer when he was just 15 years old. The loss had changed him deeply. He became quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time alone in his room or working out in the garage that Richard had converted into a small gym. Sarah tried hard to connect with Marcus during those first weeks. She would cook his favorite meals, ask about his classes, and offer to help with his homework. But Marcus kept his distance. He would answer her questions with short responses, eat quickly, and disappear back to his room. Sarah could feel his eyes on her sometimes, watching her move around the house. But whenever she looked at him directly, he would turn away. Richard traveled frequently for work. He would be gone for days at a time, leaving Sarah and Marcus alone in the big house. The silence between them grew heavy and uncomfortable. Sarah felt trapped. She had given up her apartment and her job to marry Richard, thinking she would finally have the family she always wanted. Instead, she found herself isolated and lonely. One evening in October, Marcus came home from the gym sweating and exhausted. Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner. She offered him a cold drink and asked if he wanted to talk about anything. For the first time, Marcus really looked at her. His blue eyes, so much like his father's, held hers for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "You're nothing like my mother," he said. His voice was flat, but Sarah could hear something else underneath. Not anger exactly, but something raw and painful. "I'm not trying to replace her," Sarah replied softly. "I just want us to be comfortable with each other." Marcus nodded slowly. He took the drink from her hand, their fingers touching briefly. Sarah felt a strange current pass between them. She pulled her hand back quickly, confused by the feeling. "Maybe we could start over," Marcus suggested. "I haven't been fair to you. None of this is your fault." From that evening, things began to change. Marcus started joining Sarah for dinner when Richard was away. They would watch movies together on the couch. They talked about books, music, and their lives. Sarah learned that Marcus wanted to study architecture, but felt pressure to follow his father into law. Marcus learned that Sarah had grown up in foster care and had always dreamed of having a real family. The connection between them grew stronger each day. Sarah told herself it was just friendship, just a stepmother and stepson finally finding common ground. But she knew, deep in her heart, that it was becoming something more dangerous. She saw the way Marcus looked at her now. She felt her own heart beat faster when he entered a room. By November, the line between them had become dangerously thin. Richard was away on a big case, gone for almost 2 weeks. The house felt different without him. Smaller somehow, more intimate. Sarah and Marcus moved around each other carefully, both aware of the tension building between them like a gathering storm. The first snow of winter arrived in late November. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching the white flakes fall softly onto the back garden. She wore a blue sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Behind her, she heard Marcus come down the stairs. She could feel his presence even before he spoke. "Dad called," Marcus said. "He won't be home until next Wednesday. The trial got extended." Sarah turned to face him. Marcus stood in the doorway, wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His brown hair was messy from sleep. Something in his expression made her heart skip. She knew what was about to happen. She had known for weeks now if she was honest with herself. "Marcus," she started, but he crossed the room in 3 quick steps and kissed her. Sarah knew she should push him away. She knew this was wrong in every possible way. But she had been alone for so long, and Marcus made her feel wanted in a way Richard never had. She kissed him back. That morning changed everything. They spent the day together, talking and touching, breaking every rule that should have kept them apart. Sarah felt like she was falling through space with nothing to catch her. Marcus told her he had been in love with her since the first day she moved in. He said he tried to hate her, tried to push her away, but he could not stop thinking about her. "This can never happen again," Sarah said that evening. "Your father would be destroyed. This is his worst nightmare. I know, Marcus agreed. We'll stop. We have to stop. But they did not stop. Over the next 3 weeks, whenever Richard was away, Sarah and Marcus would fall into each other's arms. They told themselves they would end it soon. They made promises to each other and broke them the next day. The guilt ate at Sarah constantly. She could barely look at Richard when he was home. She started drinking wine in the afternoons to quiet her conscience. Richard noticed the changes in his wife. She seemed distant and distracted. When he touched her, she would stiffen slightly before relaxing. He asked her several times if something was wrong. Sarah would smile and tell him she was fine, just tired. Richard wanted to believe her, so he did. Christmas came and went in a blur of forced smiles and tension. Sarah bought expensive gifts for both Richard and Marcus. She cooked a large dinner and pretended everything was normal. But under the table, Marcus's foot touched hers. Across the room, their eyes would meet and hold. Richard sat between them, completely unaware that his family was built on lies. In January, things became more complicated. Marcus started talking about the future. He would whisper to Sarah about running away together, starting a new life somewhere far from his father. Sarah would tell him to stop, that it was impossible, but part of her wanted to believe him. She was trapped in a marriage that felt empty and hollow. Richard was a good man, but she did not love him. She never had. She had married him because she was tired of being alone, tired of struggling. One cold afternoon, Richard came home early from work. He had a terrible headache and wanted to rest. He opened the front door quietly, not wanting to disturb Sarah if she was napping. He walked through the living room toward the kitchen. That was when he saw them through the glass doors that led to the sunroom. Sarah and Marcus were standing close together. Marcus had his hand on Sarah's face. They were talking quietly, seriously. Richard could not hear their words, but he could see everything in their body language. The way they leaned toward each other, the intimacy between them, his wife and his son. Richard backed away slowly, his heart pounding. He felt sick to his stomach. He walked out of the house as quietly as he had entered. He sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes, trying to process what he had seen. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was innocent. But deep down, he knew the truth. That night at dinner, Richard watched them carefully. He saw the way Marcus looked at Sarah when she passed him the salt. He noticed how Sarah's hand trembled slightly when she poured Richard's wine. Everything suddenly made sense. The distance between them, Sarah's nervousness, Marcus's improved mood over the past months. Richard said nothing. He decided to wait and watch. He needed to be sure before he confronted them. His whole world was crumbling, but he kept his face calm and normal. He made small talk about his day. He asked Marcus about his classes. He complimented Sarah's cooking. Inside, his mind was racing with dark thoughts of betrayal and revenge. February brought darker days and colder nights. Richard began to change his work schedule without telling Sarah the real reasons. He would say he was going to the office or traveling for a case, but instead he would park his car down the street and watch his own house. He felt like a stranger spying on his own life. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. On a Thursday morning, Richard told Sarah he had to fly to Boston for a deposition. He kissed her goodbye and drove away with his suitcase. But he never went to the airport. Instead, he checked into a hotel near his house and waited. At noon, he drove back to his street and parked where he could see his front door. At 2 in the afternoon, he watched Marcus come home from college. Through the windows, Richard could see Sarah greet him at the door. They embraced in a way that made Richard's blood run cold. It was not the hug of a stepmother and stepson. It was the embrace of lovers. Richard gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He watched them disappear into the house together. Richard sat in his car for 3 hours. When he finally drove away, he went to a bar and drank whiskey until his hands stopped shaking. The bartender asked if he was okay. Richard just shook his head and ordered another drink. He thought about his first wife, Marcus's mother. She had been the love of his life. When she died, he thought he would never feel that kind of pain again. He was wrong. This betrayal hurt even more. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard gathered evidence. He installed a small camera in the living room, hidden behind a picture frame. He checked Sarah's phone records and found hundreds of text messages to Marcus. The messages were deleted from her phone, But the phone company had records. He hired a private investigator who took photographs of Sarah and Marcus together when they thought Richard was away. Richard also changed his will during this time. He met with his lawyer and made new arrangements. Everything would go to a charity if he died. Marcus would get nothing. Sarah would get nothing. His lawyer asked questions, but Richard refused to explain. He just wanted everything documented and legal. At home, Richard continued to pretend nothing was wrong. But Sarah began to notice small changes in her husband. He seemed quieter than usual. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her with an expression she could not read. It made her nervous. She asked Marcus if he thought Richard suspected anything. Marcus said no, his father was just stressed about work. But Sarah's guilt was growing heavier each day. She could barely sleep at night. She would lie next to Richard in their bed and feel like a monster. She started to think about confessing everything, asking for forgiveness, trying to save her marriage. But every time she saw Marcus, her resolve would weaken. She felt pulled in two directions, unable to choose between them. One evening in late February, Richard asked Sarah to sit down with him. He poured them both wine and sat across from her at the kitchen table. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. "I want to ask you something," Richard said, "and I want you to tell me the truth." Sarah's heart began to race. Her mouth went dry. "Of course," she managed to say. "Are you happy in this marriage?" Richard asked. The question surprised Sarah. It was not what she expected. Yes, of course I am," she lied. "Don't lie to me," Richard said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes. You're miserable. We both are." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. Maybe this was her chance to tell the truth. Maybe Richard already knew and was giving her an opportunity to confess. "Richard, I think we should separate," Richard interrupted. "I think you should move out." Sarah stared at him in shock. "What? Why?" "Because this isn't working," Richard said. His voice was still calm, but Sarah could hear the anger underneath. "You married me for the wrong reasons. I think we both know that now." "Did I do something?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Are you angry about something?" Richard stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark garden. "I'm giving you a chance to leave with dignity, Sarah. I suggest you take it." That night, Sarah told Marcus what had happened. They met in the garage where they knew Richard would not hear them. Marcus was furious. He wanted to confront his father immediately, to tell him everything. Sarah begged him not to. She said she would leave quietly and they could be together once the divorce was final. "We can't wait anymore," Marcus said. He grabbed Sarah's shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Come with me tonight. We'll leave together. We'll go somewhere he can never find us." "Marcus, no," Sarah said. "We need to think clearly. If we run away together now, it will destroy your relationship with your father forever." "He's trying to control us," Marcus insisted. "He knows about us, Sarah. I'm sure of it. That's why he wants you gone. He's going to try to keep us apart." Sarah was not sure what to believe anymore. Everything was falling apart so quickly. She agreed to think about Marcus's plan. They would talk again tomorrow and make a decision together. But they never got that chance. Richard had been listening to their conversation the whole time through a baby monitor he had hidden in the garage. He heard everything, every word of their betrayal, every plan they made. As he sat in his study listening to his son and his wife plot their future together, something inside Richard broke completely. The calm mask he had been wearing for weeks finally cracked. His hands began to shake with rage. His vision blurred with tears and fury. He knew what he had to do. March arrived with rain and wind. The weather matched the darkness that had settled over the Henderson house. Richard spent the day of March 5th making final preparations. He called his office and told them he would be taking a few days off. He withdrew $5,000 in cash from his bank account. He packed a small bag and put it in the trunk of his car. To anyone watching, he seemed calm and organized, but inside his mind was filled with violent thoughts. That evening, Richard made dinner for the three of them. He cooked steaks on the grill despite the cold rain. He opened an expensive bottle of wine. Sarah and Marcus both seemed nervous, unsure why Richard was being so pleasant. They exchanged worried glances across the table. "I want to apologize," Richard said as they ate. "I've been difficult lately. Work has been stressful, and I took it out on you both. I'm sorry." Sarah felt relief wash over her. Maybe everything would be okay after all. Maybe Richard did not know anything. It's all right, she said. We understand. Marcus, you're my son, Richard continued. I want you to know that I love you. No matter what happens, you'll always be my boy. Marcus felt uncomfortable with his father's words. There was something strange in Richard's tone, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I love you too, Dad, he said quietly. After dinner, Richard suggested they watch a movie together, like a real family. Sarah and Marcus agreed, both wanting to keep Richard happy. They settled on the couch in the living room. Richard sat in his chair across from them. The movie played, but no one was really watching it. The tension in the room was thick and heavy. Around 10 o'clock, Richard stood up and stretched. I'm going to get some more wine, he announced. Anyone want anything? Sarah and Marcus both said no. Richard walked to the kitchen, but he did not go to the wine rack. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a large kitchen knife. He stood there for a moment, holding the knife in his hand, feeling its weight. His heart was pounding. His breathing was shallow. He thought about his dead wife, about the family he once had, about how these two people had destroyed everything. Richard walked back into the living room. Sarah and Marcus were sitting close together on the couch now, their shoulders touching. They did not notice him at first. Richard stood behind them, the knife hidden against his leg. I know, Richard said quietly. Sarah and Marcus both turned to look at him. Sarah's eyes went immediately to the knife. She screamed and jumped up from the couch. Marcus stood up too, holding his hands out toward his father. Dad, wait, Marcus said. Let's talk about this. Talk? Richard's voice rose with anger. You want to talk? My son and my wife having an affair behind my back. And you want to talk? Richard, please, Sarah begged. She was backing toward the door, her eyes never leaving the knife. Put that down, we can work this out. Work it out? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. How do we work out betrayal? How do we work out lies? You destroyed this family, both of you. Marcus moved between his father and Sarah. If you're going to hurt someone, hurt me, he said. This was my fault. I started it. Sarah wanted to stop, but I wouldn't let her. Marcus, no, Sarah cried. Richard looked at his son. For a moment, his expression softened. You're just a boy, he said. You don't understand what you've done, but she does. She's the adult. She should have known better. Richard moved toward Sarah with the knife raised. Marcus grabbed his father's arm, trying to stop him. The two men struggled, crashing into the coffee table. The lamp fell and shattered on the floor. Sarah ran for the front door, but her hands were shaking so badly she could not turn the lock. Behind her, she heard Marcus cry out in pain. She turned and saw her stepson fall to the ground, blood spreading across his shirt. Richard had stabbed him in the side during their struggle. The knife clattered to the floor as Richard stared at his son in horror. Marcus! Richard dropped to his knees beside his son. Oh God, what have I done? Marcus, stay with me. But Marcus's eyes were already closing. The wound was deep and bleeding heavily. Sarah stood frozen by the door, unable to move or speak. She watched as Richard tried desperately to stop the bleeding with his hands, pressing down on the wound. But there was too much blood. It pooled on the wooden floor, dark and terrible. Call an ambulance, Richard screamed at Sarah. Help him! Sarah finally moved. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed emergency services. She tried to explain what happened, but the words came out wrong and confused. The operator kept asking her to calm down and speak clearly. Marcus died before the ambulance arrived. He died in his father's arms, blood on both of them, the life draining from his young body. Richard held him and sobbed, rocking back and forth. All his anger was gone now, replaced by grief so deep it seemed to swallow him whole. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found Richard still holding his dead son. Sarah sat on the stairs, staring at nothing, in complete shock. The knife lay on the floor in a pool of blood. The evidence of what happened was clear. Richard was arrested and charged with murder. He did not resist. He barely spoke. At his trial months later, the whole story came out. The affair between Sarah and Marcus. Richard's discovery of their betrayal. The rage that led to violence. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Sarah was not charged with any crime, But her life was destroyed anyway. The news media called her the woman who caused a father to kill his son. She could not find work. People recognized her face and refused to serve her in stores. She moved to a different state and changed her name, but the guilt followed her everywhere. In prison, Richard spent his days thinking about his choices. He realized too late that his pride and anger had cost him everything. He had killed his own son, the only piece of his first wife he had left. The affair had been wrong, but murder was worse. There was no going back, no way to undo what he had done. The Henderson house stood empty for 2 years before someone finally bought it. The new owners renovated everything, trying to erase the darkness that had happened there. But people in the neighborhood remembered. They would walk past the house and think about the family that once lived there, and how love and betrayal and rage had destroyed them all.